Last week, before 1:30 p.m. American East Coast time, Conor McGregor, 29-year-old Irishman and well-known mixed martial arts fighter, was the most famous fighter in the world. He had just become the person with the record number of pay-per-view subscribers, and was reputed to have earned in his last two great fights in America up to 140 million euros. He was not only at the height of his career, but he was the worldwide role model for millions of young men and boys, because he was literally the rags to riches kid, the kid from the poor Dublin working class background who had made good by looking after himself, by going to the gym and joining his club, and by training. He had achieved incredible fame and enormous wealth. If before 1:30 last Thursday, Conor McGregor had met a very wise person and said to him, "How can I take all this fame and fortune that I've just earned, and how can I ruin it?" The wise person might have thought for a while and said, "Well, okay, seeing that most of it was based and achieved in America and now based on America, I suggest that you fly to America and take with you an entourage of supporters. Go to a mixed martial arts venue to which you were not invited, gate crash it, and start a fracas. In other words, get involved in a brawl, throw things around and do damage if possible. For example, take a metal chair, and throw it at a bus and smash the windows, and physically hurt the fighters you don't like inside the bus. And if all goes well, you might actually succeed in because of the injuries you caused, you might actually succeed in one or more events, say 3 events being cancelled. And you know yourself, because of your huge earnings, you know how much these events earn. So if you cause a number of them to be cancelled, goodness knows how much the compensation and damages against you will be. This is after all the criminal damages against you have been settled, and after you've been looked after by the judge in court. By the way, make sure that when you do this, that the cameras are running inside the centre, both the surveillance cameras, and also make sure that people on and off the bus that you attack have cameras and record this so that the world media will see it. Make sure to bring your solicitor with you and bring your checkbook, because when you are arrested, which you will be, your bail may be $50,000. And don't forget then that the court case coming up in a few weeks' time, don't forget to have a couple of million put aside for your lawyers. Now, there was no wise man giving this advice, but this is precisely what McGregor did last Thursday. And the next morning, he was not only the most famous fighter in the world in mixed martial arts circles, he was a worldwide figure on television and newspapers everywhere. Now, were there any signs beforehand that this might happen? Well, as recently as last November, right after his fame and fortune had been achieved, Conor McGregor jumped into a ring, or into a cage in Dublin, where there was a fight going on in which he was not involved, though a friend of his was winning it. And before the fight was officially declared over, he actually had a tussle with the referee and was reprimanded in public the next day by his association. Well, apart from that incident, which did show some cracks, let's look at what Conor has been doing in the last few months with his newly acquired fortune. There's 3 things he was very public about. One was that he bought not just one top-of-the-range Italian sports car, but he bought a fleet of cars, including top-of-the-range sports cars. The second thing that he publicly did was he bought a yacht, which he had in Dublin Bay, and he bought jet skis. The third thing he did involved a fun fair. Every year after Christmas in Dublin, there is a fun fair known as Funderland. It's the usual fun fair with rides and things inside it. He rented this out exclusively for himself and his family for one day or one evening, and the public were not allowed in. Now let me just think briefly about these 3 things. First, I've only ever been able to drive one car. Now, I do know that there are people and there are billionaires that like to have fleets of cars, I understand that. But certainly I could not deal with more than one car, and if I had a fleet of cars, it would be a huge problem. I can speak with a little bit more confidence about yachts in Dublin Bay, because I've been on a yacht in Dublin Bay. And for those viewers who may not be Irish, and many of you will not be in Ireland, I may have to remind you that Ireland is situated in the North Atlantic. And for at least 10 months of the year, The most pleasant thing about being on a yacht in Dublin Bay is getting back to land. And it's certainly for most of the year is no place for jet skis. But the thing that interests me most of all is the renting out of the funfair. Because in my fantasies, I imagine that I have hundreds of millions of pounds, and I decide to rent it, that I want to rent exclusively for my family. I want to rent Coney Island or even Disneyland. I'm in little doubt that if I was forcing my children and grandchildren to go on as many rides as possible, not because I wanted to get value for my money, but because I wanted them to enjoy themselves, that by mid-afternoon they might be crying to get back home. But there's something even more serious about sudden wealth. I actually know somebody, I won't say what country it's in, but I know somebody who briefly was a neighbour of a woman that had won the 100 million European lotto jackpot. And that woman had to go and live in a country house with surveillance equipment all around the house and even searchlights at night. Not so much for fear of gangs or kidnapping, but possibly from fear that some of her own family or extended family might feel that she had not donated enough to them. What she'd actually succeeded in doing with the 100 million which she achieved overnight was that she succeeded in getting herself a private prison in the countryside in which she was a prisoner and in which she had to pay for the guards. Now the next morning after the event last Thursday night, the next morning and the next day there were calls to their Irish radio stations about the McGregor's behaviour. One caller in particular struck me because he called from Florida saying that he'd been down to his local gas station and was horrified to see the headlines in all the papers, including the American Nationals, which headlined the brawling that McGregor had been involved in. And the reason he was horrified, like a lot of other Irish Americans and Canadian Irish, was that there are two images of the fighting Irishman. The first is a rather noble image, the one of the good fireman that saves lives, the good New York and Boston cop who's Irish, the hard-headed American politician who one day goes on to become the President of the United States. The second image is the image of the brawling Irishman, complete with the cudgel, or in the old days as it was called, the shillelagh, getting involved in fights and smashing up things. That's the image that the Irish American in particular hates, and that the Irish hate all over the world. Now, why am I, an old man more than twice McGregor's age, sitting in County Wexford, Ireland, on a rainy day, concerned with this? Well, the reason is that I have actually been through something like this before. Over 50, nearer to 60 years ago, when I was a young man, a programmer, one of the world's first programmers in a state-of-the-art company called Bell Telephone, living and working in Canada in the United States. Bell was part of the American telephone and telegraph system, which in turn controlled Bell Labs, which was one of the most advanced companies in the world making space equipment. As one of the world's first programmers, I was highly respected as an Irishman and expected as Irish to be witty, to be articulate and to be intelligent, and I hope I was some of all three. I was also quite literate, because 3 years later, in 1963, I moved from Bell to IBM and I began to write computer books. So I was treated with respect, and I loved being Irish. Now, in 1960, after I'd been there for about 3 years, word began to come to me from Ireland that there was an Irishman clowning around in Ireland and in London and making a fool of himself. And this word was coming by airmail letter, because phone calls were very expensive back then and there was no electronic communications. Now, that man was a playwright called Brendan Behan, whose play Borstal Boy had just made it onto the West End. And he was making a name for himself, not just on the streets, but also going on radio and television and being drunk much of the time. He was turning up in the theatre at his own plays, and from the audience he was heckling the actors. And it was reported that on at least one occasion he climbed onto the stage and interrupted the play. One story said that he even went to the line-up of people outside queuing for tickets, and he sang songs like busking, like begging for money, at the line-up outside the theatre where his own play was. Now, all of that was appearing, some of that was appearing in snippets only in the American and Canadian media, so it was little concern to me, except that in 1960 his play went from the West End to Broadway. And for the next 3 years, over the next 3 years, for at least 18 months of that time, he came to America and Canada and he toured. And he became a well-known clown, acting the paddy whackery, the Irishman, getting involved in brawls and being drunk. And at first he was a great joke to millions of Americans and Canadians, but not, I hasten to add, to the Irish in America, to whom he was a great embarrassment. And he was appearing on television drunk, and like most drunks as time went on, he was becoming less and less funny and more boring. I found it, when my colleagues would say to me, "What do you think of your fellow countryman and his behaviour last night?" I found it very embarrassing. Now I'm sitting here, and McGregor, days after the event, only after the events in Brooklyn, I'm sitting here with McGregor still in America. I'm sitting here wondering what's going to happen when he gets back. And I'm also thinking, what does the Irish government think of this man? And what does some of the people in the agencies that I was formerly involved with think of him? For example, what did they think of him in the Irish Tourist Board or in the Irish Department of External Affairs? But even more importantly, I'm thinking, what about all the coaches and trainers for whom McGregor has been a role model for the young men joining the clubs? What's this going to do to their MMA? What's this going to do to boxing? Because he was also a boxer. And what are the parents of all these young men and boys going to think of it? Conor McGregor's nickname was the Notorious. Well, through the events of last Thursday, he has really lived up to that name.